I'm here today to make a shameful confession, and that is that I've always been jealous of Gen X's contributions to filmmaking. So if you're Gen X, please feel free to gloat in the comments. But it is true. I mean, just look at the list of names. Kevin Smith, Robert Rodriguez, Steven Soderbergh, Noah Baumbach, Wes Anderson, Anton Fuqua, Spike Jonze, Sofia Coppola, Ben Stiller, Harmony Korine, the Wachowskis, Lynn Ramsey, John Singleton, Quentin Tarantino, and P.T. Anderson, among many others. As a millennial, I grew up idolizing these people, and I couldn't wait to see what my fellow millennials would do once we were in charge. But now, in the 2020s, with millennials firmly in our 30s and 40s, I have to ask, what's the millennial style? Do we even have one? It's embarrassing, but it's also not entirely our fault. We entered an entertainment industry that was already in the midst of being disrupted. Social media shattered the monoculture, meaning it was increasingly rare for movies to have a major cultural impact like Pulp Fiction or The Matrix had. Netflix disrupted the entire business model, especially physical media. And Disney acquired as many studios and brands as it could. The film industry today is less influential, more consolidated, and much less profitable than it was just 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean millennials haven't done anything. Movies are still being made, and we, as a generation, are increasingly the ones making them. So, like a good millennial YouTuber, I decided to make a top 10 list to answer. First up, the ground rules. I'm going with the Pew Research Center's definition of generations, so if you disagree, please take it up with them. In order to keep things simple and quick, I have to be firm in the age ranges. That means if a filmmaker was born in 1980, sorry, they're Gen X. This ends up disqualifying quite a few directors you might have expected, like Jordan Peele, Mike Flanagan, and John M. Chu, for example. Next, they have to have directed at least 2 feature films that got a wide release in theaters or on a major streaming service. I'm also not counting TV producers. That means Donald Glover, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and Rachel Sennett, for example, don't count because just writing, producing, or starring in movies doesn't count. They need to have directed at least 2 movies as well. Next, I'm evenly weighting the scores between 2 categories: career trajectory and their film's subject matter. To be a truly millennial filmmaker, your career trajectory has to have been a bit of a hassle. So if you were born a Nepo baby, you haven't exactly struggled in what I would consider the true millennial fashion. Nepo babies aren't strictly banned from the list, but they'd have better made some damn fine films. Special consideration will be given to films that have spoken to millennial interests and issues. Finally, I'm only including English language filmmakers because if I open this up to all international directors, this would just be too unwieldy. All right, that's enough table setting. Let's eat. That's right, baby, we are starting with a hot take. Fennell has established herself as a distinctive and often controversial millennial voice. In 2020, she made her first feature film, the polarizing Promising Young Woman, and then she followed it up with Saltburn, a movie that became something of an internet sensation. Saltburn was a hit with Gen Z, and honestly, what's more millennial than trying to look cool to younger people? Up next is her adaptation of Wuthering Heights, which already has a bunch of discourse swirling around it, even though it hasn't even come out yet. So I would say Emerald's brand remains strong. Why is she only number 10? Well, she comes from money, like old-ass English aristocracy money. She's not technically a Nepo baby within the industry, but she hasn't exactly had to struggle. Ultimately, what gets her on the list is that she's forging her own path. She hasn't been pulled into the Hollywood franchise meat grinder, which we'll see is kind of a common theme on this list. Speaking of that, after making a bunch of small indie films, Adam Wingard broke out in 2011 with You're Next, which is a really fun action horror comedy. He followed that up with The Guest, another stylish, funny horror thriller. Both films have a very millennial vibe. They rely on a mix of 80s genre aesthetics and modern trappings like synth scores and meta commentaries on gender roles within the horror genre. And hey, millennials love nothing more than deconstructing genre tropes while simultaneously paying slavish homage to them. Wingard, like Fennell, was establishing himself as an original voice, but then he made the mistake of becoming extremely successful. After kind of a rough patch with the Blair Witch reboot and the Death Note adaptation, he landed the directing gig for Godzilla vs. Kong, and the follow-up, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. Today, Wingard seems to be setting himself up as a reliable franchise director, just like one-time Gen X indie auteur Jon Favreau did at Disney. There aren't very many millennial directors who have made a successful jump to mega-budget franchises, and I feel like he deserves some credit for having done that. Nia DaCosta might have the most quintessentially millennial career path on this list. She went to film school, then started working on film sets at the very bottom as a production assistant, which is a very difficult and very admirable approach, and I respect the hell out of it. DaCosta also follows the classic millennial arc of starting with an indie darling, getting a shot at relaunching a franchise, being swept up into the Marvel machine and being spit back out again, and then returning to her own indie projects again, wiser and battle-tested. Most recently, alongside directing Hedda, she also directed the 28 years later sequel, The Bone Temple, which comes out in 2026, and I'm genuinely curious to see what she does with it. DaCosta makes this list because she's a hustler, and while that's not a uniquely millennial trait, it is something that we've had to really hone. We're not just going to be handed creative control and massive budgets like the new Hollywood guys were. We've got to earn it, and DaCosta is earning it. Zach Cregger has been around since the 2000s as part of the Whitest Kids You Know comedy troupe. But in the last few years, he's made a new name for himself, directing horror films that are, in my opinion, bridging the gap between the A24-style elevated horror and Blumhouse-style crowd pleasers. His films also have a very millennial sensibility. Barbarian and Weapons are as funny as they are scary, and both feature lived-in, well-observed characters who are grappling with supernatural or at least deeply unnatural scenarios. I think Cregger's strength is in how he deftly mixes realism with absurdity, without resorting to breaking the fourth wall with wry, knowing quips like a certain generation does. Cregger also does the very millennial thing of Trojan horsing societal commentary into the horror genre. Again, we are definitely not the first to do this. Obviously, everyone from Jordan Peele to John Carpenter to George Romero have used horror to say something about society for decades now. But I do think Cregger is really good at weaving his film's commentary into the story and the characters. We can't avoid it forever, so let's talk about A24. Like Miramax in the 90s with Gen X, it's hard to overstate A24's influence on modern filmmaking and on millennial filmmaking in particular. Much of that is due to the studio's development of and support for younger up-and-coming directors like Robert Eggers in the 2010s. One of the big critiques of A24 is that it relies heavily on aesthetics while ignoring substance. I don't mean that A24 has a specific aesthetic, but rather that its films foreground their aesthetics at the expense of their stories or characters. This often results in anachronistic metatextual pastiches meant to evoke a film era or genre at the expense of the film itself. And one of the directors who helped establish A24's aesthetic reputation is Robert Eggers. Do I think the criticism of Eggers and A24 is fair? Not always. While I do think Eggers sometimes gets a little lost in the technical minutiae and aesthetic qualities of his films, I also think The Lighthouse is one of the best movies of the past decade. I'm not sure there are any other directors who scream millennial more than Daniels. Believe it or not, they've only made 2 feature films so far, but those films are Swiss Army Man and Everything Everywhere all at once. Daniels traffic in maximalism, embracing Adult Swim-style absurdism in both their production design and editing techniques. They weave in blatant homage and references to kung fu, sci-fi, and fantasy genres. Daniels got their start in music videos, and it shows. Both of their movies have that surreal, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks music video vibe to them. Everything Everywhere got some pretty heavy pushback from the Reddit Letterboxd crowd online. In fact, their films feel custom-made in a lab to create discourse. Even just calling themselves Daniels feels like an invitation for people to get mad at them. But let's be honest, what's more millennial than arguing online? It's been a few years since Everything Everywhere, and while they've announced a bunch of projects, nothing's actually come to pass yet. But also, having your future and career continually deferred? Baby, you know that's millennial. So, I don't actually have a ton to say about Josh and Benny Safdie other than they're insanely talented. They have been singular voices since they broke through with Heaven Knows What, and then when they really hit the mainstream with Good Time and Uncut Gems. They're just annoyingly talented. Good Time and Uncut Gems are two of my favorite movies of the past decade. While I haven't seen Smashing Machine yet, Marty Supreme is another masterpiece. I know I said this list wasn't about critical appraisal, but in this case, it is a little bit. It'll be interesting to see if they continue going in their own separate ways or if they do come back together to co-direct again. Either way, it seems like they're both well established to continue making truly great films. All right, so before we get to the top 3, let's look at some honorable mentions. These directors just barely missed the list, and I wanted to shout them out for one reason or another. She's
the voice of my generation,
so I had to include her. But she's had a lot more impact and success in TV rather than film, and I think her influence has faded since the heyday of Girls. Like Zach Cregger and Daniels, she has 2 films that have made a big impact, but they haven't been quite as big. I think she's got potential, but she hasn't quite broken through enough to make the cut. His films feel kind of timeless. They don't have a particularly millennial vibe. And that's not a criticism, necessarily. It just means he hasn't quite made the list. Honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of Saint Maud, but I adored Love Lies Bleeding, which at first felt like it was going to be that all style over substance thing that I was talking about earlier. But it ended up revealing so much more depth and nuance, and I am genuinely excited to see what she does next. Does Inside count as a feature film? I think it actually does, but it still isn't quite enough to get him on the list. Speaking of YouTubers turned filmmakers, Talk to Me was fantastic, but I actually haven't seen Bring Her Back yet. I think they're close to making the list, they just didn't quite cut it yet. It does make me think though that I should probably make a video about YouTubers who have and haven't been successful in making the leap to feature films. Don't steal that, that one's mine. An Oscar winner with her own Marvel debacle and a triumphant return to indie filmmaking, Zhao shares a lot in common with others on this list. However, she's also the daughter of a billionaire industry tycoon, which means there's no real struggle there. That doesn't disqualify her, but if it's between her and Emerald Fennell, I think Fennell's style is just a little bit more millennial. So, sorry to all the Zhao heads out there. I'd put them at number 11. I loved the original indie spirit of We're All Going to the World's Fair. It does a lot with basically nothing. And I Saw the TV Glow was actually my favorite movie of 2023. I think if their next film, Teenage Sex and Death at Camp Miasma, is as good as Glow, they just might kick Fennell out of the top 10. Here we go, baby. Let's do top 3. Let's go. I'm pretty sure Ryan Coogler is the most consistently successful director on this list. Starting with 2013's Fruitvale Station, the man has simply never missed. If anyone in my generation can become the next Christopher Nolan, I'd wager all my money on Coogler. Just like Nolan, after starting with an indie, Coogler relaunched a franchise and got swept up into the superhero machine. Also like Nolan, and unlike DaCosta and Zhao, Coogler was not only able to survive his superhero phase, he's thrived. To this day, Black Panther is the only Marvel movie to be nominated for Best Picture. Famously, since wrapping up the Dark Knight trilogy, Nolan has only done his own projects. Coogler is still planning to do Black Panther 3, which makes Sinners his Inception. I predict that once he's done at Marvel, Coogler will start pumping out big-budget original films that'll end up giving Nolan a run for his money. Basically, the only reason Coogler isn't at the top of this list is because he spent so much time doing franchises and superhero movies rather than his own original projects. But I do think he's got more potential than anyone else here to be our generation's most influential and successful director. Ari Aster answers the age-old question, what if Woody Allen had been talented? What's interesting to me about Aster is that he, alongside Robert Eggers, helped establish A24's reputation for aesthetics that I was talking about earlier. Hereditary and Midsommar are two of the most quintessential elevated horror films A24 has done. Since then, though, Aster has continued his signature panic attack vibe of Midsommar while also expanding well beyond horror. Beau is Afraid and Eddington are kind of hard to categorize. They're also pretty polarizing. Personally, I think Eddington is one of the best films of 2025, but I get that it's not for everyone. For one thing, it's open to interpretation, And there's nothing people hate more than ambiguity these days, which could be a problem for Aster's career long term. His movies don't shy away from having morally gray, delusional, unpleasant, unreliable protagonists, and it's unclear who, if anyone, we should be rooting for in them. So, Aster is a neurotic head case struggling with the moral ambiguity of existing in American culture, as well as his own culpability as a creator of that culture. That sounds pretty millennial to me. This might come as a bit of a surprise at first, but I think there are a lot of very good reasons why Greta deserves the top spot, both for her films and for how she's navigated the industry. Gerwig started as an actor. She was a big part of the mumblecore film movement, which was spearheaded by Gen X stalwarts Mark and Jay Duplass. Something I really like about Gerwig is that she was properly broke. Despite acting in hit indie films and being considered a New York it girl, she had to make ends meet by nannying and tutoring. That is some true millennial cred, in my opinion. Then she found her way into Noah Baumbach's orbit and did the one thing any true millennial dreams of doing: hooking up with a famous Gen X director. Gerwig started co-writing with Baumbach and starred in several of his films. Then in 2017, she directed her first feature, Lady Bird. Next, she did the classic millennial move of adapting a beloved literary work. I genuinely love her take on Little Women, and it's not just because it features the best Bob Odenkirk cameo of all time.
My Little Women.
Though that does help. After that, she got pulled into the franchise meat grinder, just like Wingard, DaCosta, and Coogler. But looking back on it now, it is truly remarkable that Gerwig was able to turn a cynical studio IP play not just into a hit, but into the cultural phenomenon of the decade so far. And it managed to keep her distinct voice and aesthetic as well. That's especially impressive because it's clear that even Warner Brothers didn't have a whole lot of faith in the project, given that like a solid 10 minutes of runtime are devoted to an extended Chevy commercial. But even with the egregious product placement in a movie that is literally just one big product placement, Barbie managed to be original, clever, and resonant to a very wide audience. As of now, Gerwig is working on a Narnia reboot. Time will tell if she gets absorbed into the studio system even further, or if she's able to keep that distinct voice and style. While she's at the top of this list right now, the competition is pretty fierce, and she will have to do a lot to protect her perch, especially as the industry continues to contract and audiences continue to splinter. But hey, she's a millennial, so I think she's up to the challenge. Did your favorite not make the list? Do you think someone on there doesn't deserve it? Let me know below. And while you're at it, be sure to like and subscribe and all that, and thanks so much for watching. See ya.